Okay, so we're going to take a look at some of these semantic elements and try using them. This will be quick, even though we're going to talk about quite a few elements, because as I mentioned earlier, they don't really do anything different, they just have different names. Okay, so here are some of the examples of elements you could use in place of a div or just a generic container. We're going to begin with a main, or the main element, which is supposed to represent the dominant content of the body of a document. Basically, it should be the main content of your page, and it should exclude any content that would be repeated across the page. So things like, or that would be repeated across different pages, sidebars, nav links, copyright information, logos, search forms. That does not really pertain to the main content of a page. So, for example, on Wikipedia here, if we were to have a main, I would put it around the main content here. So not this nav bar, not this search, not this sidebar, but everything that has to do with the chicken main content, all of this stuff. So you don't have to do this, right? It could just be divs, but that's where I would use a main. So I'll do the same thing here. Let's add a main element, and our website right now is just sort of garbage and doesn't have much meaning anyway, but let's say it ends all the way at the bottom. We don't have any sort of nav bar or anything yet, but we will shortly. Okay, so nothing changes, but we have now highlighted or written an element that explains, here's the main content. The next semantic element we'll look at is the nav. So the nav is supposed to represent anything on the page that provides navigation links. So that could be links to other parts on the same page, like we have on Wikipedia, right? These aren't links to go somewhere else, they're just taking me to a different part of the page, or it could be links to completely different resources. Both are just navigation links. So a nav is very simple. You just fill it with whatever content you want. It should contain links. For now, we haven't seen how to actually create, nice looking nav bars or anything like that. But if we wanted to just fake it and add a nice little nav here with some links, I would probably do an unordered list with some LIs and then an anchor tag. Let's just make this up. We'll do home. And let's do a couple of them. I just used that shortcut I mentioned a while back. And then we'll do what else? Instead of home, let's do about. So these won't actually go anywhere. Actually, I think we do have an about.html, don't we? And then, do we? Yep. So we could link to that. And then we could have a contact or something, which won't do anything either. But the point is here just to show you how we would use a nav element. So if I refresh, it looks just like LIs instead of a UL, because that's all that it is. We have this wrapping nav that explains this is for navigational content. So it doesn't just have to be the top nav of a page. It could be any navigational links, as we saw in Wikipedia. It could be the sidebar, or here on MDN, I would assume this is a nav, and probably this breadcrumb right here that just shows us how we arrived where we are. If we actually inspect, we'll probably find that out. Let's see. Yep, so there's a nav right there, and I think there's a nav right here. Is there? Yep. So it doesn't have to be there, but they make sense to use. So that's all there is to nav elements. Screen readers will look for these and call them out, just like a web crawler would as well. Next up, we have the section element. The section element is still quite generic. It's just supposed to represent a standalone section of an application or of a website. It doesn't really say anything other than that, but it's still far better than a div. A div is just a generic container. You could use a div for anything. As we saw on that Medium website, a div was used to make a button. A div was used, this could be a div right here. This could be a div here. This whole thing could be a div. These could each be divs. But a section is really supposed to be a section of content, a standalone section of your website. And MDN says that it represents a standalone section which does not have a more specific semantic element. So you could use a section in place of a nav, just like you could use a div in place of everything. But a nav makes more sense. It's more meaningful or more specific. So what I would use a section for is probably on this markup, something like this right here might be a single section. I mean, it's kind of hideous, but that could be a section. And then this could be a section where we have a standalone section of content. We've got our heading, and then we've got a paragraph or two. And this could be a section, you'd have to figure out where you break it up. But if we go back to Wikipedia, I think it's a little clearer. This could be a section of content. And then this right here, maybe you do it for each chunk. So that's a section there. You don't have to, but it's just one option for dividing up your markup. And I'll do one example. Why don't we put a section in right around this H2, so section, and this paragraph just to here. So just keep it simple. I won't waste your time, but I would add these around every section of content if we want to section things off. Nothing looks different, but now this is grouped together as a section of our larger document. So you don't have to do that, but if you were going to group it in some way, like if I wanted to add a border or a different color, I would have used a div, but a section makes more sense. Next up, we have the article element, which represents a self-contained composition in a document. So this does not have to be reserved only for, a newspaper article or a blog article. So you can see in the demo here, they consider this an article on MDN. And in fact, there's actually multiple sub-articles. So you can have more than one article on a page. It's really just supposed to be any self-contained composition. So anything that should be independently distributable or reusable. So this could be something, this little weather widget that you might use across different websites. You've probably seen something similar before, where at least I see it all the time, where I get like on the newspaper or on a blog, I'll get a weather in my zip code widget from, I don't know if it's weather.com or Google Weather or whatever it is. So articles are just another element that we use to group content together. There are a couple of notes. There should be a heading that explains what the article is or what it's about. So you could have something like a film review article, and inside of that you could have a bunch of sections or even sub-articles. This can be a little confusing, and one of the hardest things about these semantic elements is that people use them differently. So I'm not trying to show you one way or one set of rules that you must follow. I just want to expose you to the fact that there is an article element, and you could use it, and I might use it on if I was making Wikipedia, I might wrap all of this in an article. Not the sidebar, not the navbar or any of that, but the actual main content here. Another element is the aside. So an aside is supposed to be something that is not really part of the document. Well, it could be part of it, but it's not essential. It's indirectly related. It's tangential. It is not essential. So they're often presented as sidebars, call-out boxes. I would not be surprised if this was an aside. Let's inspect. Yeah, it is an aside. Well, when I open up, you probably saw that. When I open up the DevTools, there we go. It comes back. Okay, so it's a responsive site. It changes and reorders and resizes as the window changes. But there you go. We can see that is an aside. It's pretty much just like any of these other elements we've seen. You use them instead of a generic container. So the example on MDN is an article about salamanders, and then there's this little aside here that's just a note, a little bonus topic about the rough-skinned newt and its deadly neurotoxin. They actually live with me around here. They don't live with me in my house, but I see them all the time on my driveway. Very interesting creatures and very toxic. Then we've got header and footer, two of the more commonly used ones. They are kind of self-explanatory, I guess. The header element is supposed to be any sort of introductory content. It often will include navigational content as well, as we saw on Stripe, or if we go to Wikipedia. This whole thing up here could be a header. I don't think they use semantic elements, but if we look at Stripe again, you can see that up top, we do have the navigation area. I really like this little menu, by the way. It's very fancy JavaScript. But the header itself actually includes all of this. This is all introductory content. So it doesn't have to. It's totally up to you or up to the developers, but I think, it does include all of that content. And then we move on to our first main section of the site, and then another section and another section. So the header is the introductory content, and the footer is this whole thing down here. And both of them often will include links and navigations and navs that are nested. And along those lines, you can also put a header inside of other elements. So you could have an article element with a header inside of it and a footer. So you can have more than one footer on a page. Here's an example of a footer located inside of an article. It would look like this. Here's our footer for the article. And this could be on a web page. It actually is right now, where we have an actual footer, a typical footer at the very bottom. So there's a lot of flexibility. This isn't super rigid. Just keep in mind the general intent, the semantics of each of these elements. So we've got header and footer. If we wanted to put a footer in, I'll just do that for now. On this example, we don't really have much, but maybe at the bottom after our main, we can put our footer, and in here, I don't know, a paragraph. This is my website, and maybe a UL with an LI and an anchor tag, just gibberish, contact. And is there anything else we should put here? I don't know. How about help? So there's our footer at the bottom. Doesn't look like anything, but that is a footer element, and that's the sort of content we would put in a footer. And then we could put a header up top. It works exactly the same. So header, footer, and then I won't show examples of these, but there are a couple more elements. There are things like a time element. Now this one is actually a bit different. It is an inline element. You wrap it around some piece of content that represents a time or a date time or just a date. So you can see here, there's a time element being wrapped around this July 7. There's another time around 2000, around 20 here. And it's being made bold through CSS, but that's not actually what the time element does. It's purely there to call something out as time in a machine-readable format, and you are supposed to specify this date time attribute. Not super important for now, but just know this is another semantic element. We've also got a figure element, which represents apparently a self-contained piece of content with an optional caption. So here is a figure, and it contains another element called a fig caption. So you could just use a div, as always, but a figure calls out some special meaning to this. It's usually an illustration, a diagram, something that you want to call attention to, and may often have a caption alongside it. So something like this could be a figure over here, or certainly that would. Now, I don't think Wikipedia does this, but it's just another element that you have at your disposal. So there are still others we have not talked about, the abbreviation element, the data element, but they're not that essential for now. Just keep in mind this concept of semantic elements, semantic markup, where instead of using generic containers, we can use things like a main and a nav. We can use a section. We can use a header and a footer to call out or to add meaning to the actual markup itself. This is useful for us as developers just to look at our code and immediately understand what's going on. It's important for screen readers and improving accessibility, and it's also essential for SEO.